So, and Mary on the flip side, well, the church has had some problems with Mary because the church's tradition says that Joseph died. He wasn't present during Jesus' ministry, and of course not at the crucifixion. And so Mary was a widow. Within the Mediterranean world at that time, widows were a very impoverished class. There really wasn't the option to get remarried. Strangely enough, widowers didn't like to marry widows. They preferred the young fresh thing on the corner. So, according to their means, of course, they would marry, a younger woman. And so widows, generally speaking, especially if they didn't have children, they were the poorest of the poor. They didn't have jobs, they didn't have educations in many cases. And so it was a very difficult reality. Mary was a widow, and her son was crucified on the cross, her only son. And so that kind of backfired on the church because, of course, the first representations of Mary, you can see them in the catacombs, they show her in the early 4th century, late 3rd century. She's dressed in black. Black is the widow color. Does anyone know why it's the widow color? Pardon?
The absence of color.
Yes, but it's also the cheapest color. Because the companies that dyed fabrics, throughout they would dye, you have to keep the fabric, the colors hot, or as a part of the dyeing process, so it would take onto the cloth. They would dye in the most expensive colors and the most expensive fabrics, and then throughout the day continue the process, and then at the end of the day, they would take all the colors, whatever is left in each of the stone vats, and they would pour it into one. And you got the color black. I don't know about black, but it was a nasty, ugly color. And so this color, then, they would throw into it the cheapest of woven fabric, and that would be what poor people, and especially widows, would make their clothes out of. And so Mary was dressed originally in black, because it was a part of her social reality. And since her son died, the son that was supposed to provide for her and take care of her, and even though he assigned John to take care of her, she was still a widow. And the early church thought, well, okay, we can dress Jesus up as a philosopher, give him white and gold clothes so that it would point to this reality of humanity and divinity. And then we'll kind of give Mary a slimming black and she can be in the background. That backfired. Because, of course, human nature saw Jesus and they're like, wow, that's really cool. And they saw Mary, they're like, oh, poor Mary. Come here, Mary, let me hold you. And so it was like, okay, we got to change Mary's color. So you see, in the first 400 years of Christianity, you see actually Mary's color lightening a little bit. And so in the 5th century, Mary begins to appear in a very dark blue. A blue that could be black, but it's way too expensive to actually be black. And slowly this blue, because it was still being mistaken for black, it becomes purple. And purple was the most expensive color to produce. No surprise that by the 7th and 8th century, Mary was also appearing with crowns and jewelry and earrings, and so things changed a little bit for her. But the reality, of course, was there was always this struggle to express theology. I mean, for many people, religion and faith can become very emotional. And for many people it is. Look at how many people come to church for Christmas and Easter. Those are all those emotional Christians. But it's not this reality of trying to figure out Mary's place. It wasn't that Mary had anything to do with it. It was more how to express the message to us so that we get the point and don't get distracted by the other variables, such as, Mary being a widow and losing her son, and so this way, that's why you see this development in the colors, because the church is trying to be faithful to the message, give the details in the right way, without getting people too emotional. Because we're trying to express the faith and learn about it through the story, through the Gospels, through the Gospel, the writings, the Proto-Evangelion of James. That is an attempt to express the theology so that we have a better understanding on this great mystery of the Incarnation that begins with Mary. Now it's interesting, I'd like to conclude by looking at a text that comes from the letter to the Romans. Then, as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one man's act of righteousness leads to acquittal and life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience many will be made righteous. And the Fathers, this is interesting because although you could say that we're talking about one man, that man would be Jesus, the Fathers actually saw Jesus and Mary. So they saw that in the first one, that one man's trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one man's act of righteousness, which is death on the cross, leads to acquittal and life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience, Eve and that apple, many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience, which would be Mary's yes, many will be made righteous. So they actually they read this text saying that this is really about Mary, that second phrase. And it is in a way, I think it also does empower Mary. Mary was invited into this mystery. And I've mentioned a couple of times when we celebrate the Feast of the Annunciation, I like to remind people that, the gospel story, the story of the Annunciation, the angel coming to Mary, is a success story. The angel invited Mary to participate, and Mary said yes. And you have to wonder if maybe God didn't send that angel a couple of times out already to other women who said, no way. Because that you're not going to hear in the gospel. But she was invited, she wasn't forced. And so I think in reading this from the letter to the Romans, that affirms it. That really, despite the way that we look at her as quiet and demure, few words, this was a young woman who was very strong-willed, who was filled with faith, who really and truly did see God's plan for her beyond what was a messy situation. And I guess just as a little addendum, I would like to say messy situation because Joseph could have divorced her. Had he divorced her and said that she had an affair with somebody, that she would have been stoned to death. Her child would have been killed according to the law. So Joseph's role was very important in preserving the life of both Mary and Jesus. But we do know from the gospel tradition, of course, that Joseph was a good and virtuous and upright man. And so he had decided to divorce Mary quietly. You know what that means? He was going to divorce her, but he was going to take the paternity of the child. That he was the father. He was going to make himself look like a deadbeat dad. But he couldn't bear, living with the fact that this was someone else's child. So, but this way she would have been spared, the consequences of that. But of course, the question then becomes legitimacy. Because he needs to have a legitimate father who claims fatherhood over him. That's Joseph's role. And because that is a part of the messianic promise. The child has to come from the Davidic line. And that is through Joseph and in a way through Mary also, but especially through Joseph. So, any questions?
Father, I just don't understand why the Jewish people, the way you explained everything tonight, it makes so much sense. How come they can't really believe in Jesus? I mean, is there something I'm missing here? I mean, obviously, is there tradition? So I have really close friends who I adore. And I said, if I wasn't Catholic, I'd be Jewish. I'd be Jew for Jesus, of course. But, it's like, wow, and then when you said it, just makes so much sense.
I think that within Judaism, there are many opinions as to what is the nature of the Messiah. And especially in the time of Jesus, there was a hope that the Messiah would be a kind of a George Washington figure who would lead them from under the Romans into their own country, their own kingdom, where they could be free of foreign domination. There were, of course, small pockets that saw the Messiah as being a spiritual reality. But see, like one of the things that I think was never, we do have to say, one thing to say though, that many Jews did believe in Jesus. Because we're here today because of those Jewish Christians. And so it wasn't just the 12. I mean, you're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of people who did believe. And so the remnant, the people who rejected his messiahship, so they based it on different factors because of probably what their expectation was. They did not see, the idea of a life after death, a return into paradise, was not a real option within the Old Testament mindset. Many Jews at the time of Jesus did not believe in life after death. And that is still something that is a big theme among contemporary Jewish theology. There's a lot of speculation. It was thought that God would reward your faithfulness in this life. So if you were rich, God was rewarding you. And of course, if you didn't use that for the benefit of the people of Israel, then he would smite you. So the reward was pretty much immediate. And so I think that's probably one of the main factors, because it's kind of, that was not really answered, what is the nature of this Messiah?
So they're still waiting for some.
They are still waiting, and there is, especially when it comes to Orthodox, Hasidic Judaism, and even large parts of conservative Judaism, there is an awareness that the Messiah will be some sort of a spiritual figure, not just a political leader, or not just some rabbi, but actually someone who will bring the people of Israel to a completely different level of connectedness with God. How, again, that's the speculation. There are a lot of opinions on that. Judaism is splintered into many different religious currents, and that wasn't different. Remember we hear about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, And then you hear about the people who are running the temple, then the Essenes, who they were probably the most spiritual. They were kind of, you could say, Jewish monastics almost. And so you had a lot of different currents even at that time, and that's probably the main reason.